Give me a second as I start my video.
Are you going in right now?
Cool. Excellent. I'm glad it's being recorded. You know, elephant seals historically were spread all along the California coast in Mexico. You know, so before humans, they were very numerous, and you know, their populations were quite large. But you know, at the end of the 1800s, with the arrival of the gold rush, the population essentially decimated. Why? Well, a lot of whalers ran out of whales, and they decided to start rendering elephant seal oil for blubber for oil. And elephant seals, unfortunately, don't have a lot of defense tactics, so they were easy targets. And so over the course of about 20 years, their population basically went down to nearly zero, and they were nearly extirpated along their conventional coastline. The last remaining population was found on Isla de Guadalupe. I don't know how many of you have ever been there or heard of this island. It's amazing. It's beautiful. It's about 150 nautical miles off the coast of Baja. And there were a handful of seals that had managed to survive and avoid all of these hunters. And then a collector from the Smithsonian landed upon Guadalupe Island and found about 9 remaining seals. And instead of letting them be, of course, he collected them, he killed them, took them aboard and brought them back to the Smithsonian and stuffed them, because that was what you did at that time. And so again, they were deemed extinct after that last that last research trip. However, somehow a few animals were still out at sea. And so from this very, very tiny population, we think less than 20 individuals survived. The population rebounded, and they actually have recolonized their historic range. And since then have re-expanded, and actually now there's new colonies popping up all over the place as far as Vancouver. So at present, as of 2014, actually, that was the last kind of wide range study that was conducted. We know there are about 210,000 individuals, and their populations are increasing along the California coast of Mexico, and really the Pacific coast, about 3 to 4% each year. However, given this extreme genetic bottleneck that they went through, they retain very, very low genetic variability. And in fact, they're probably one of the most genetically limited animals of any animal that we have studied extensively. But despite that, they have endured, and they now breed at dozens of different sites, you know, throughout the Pacific Northwest, which we're very grateful for. So when you see an elephant seal, first you have to stop and say, this animal basically rebounded from near extinction. I mean, it's very similar to the stories that you hear of these baleen whales that have made this miraculous recovery, right, from whaling. The elephant seal has gone through a similar recovery. And then what I focus on, and what I will try to communicate, is the amazing life of a male elephant seal in particular. And that's what I study. I study male behavior because I'm really interested in intersexual competition. And northern elephant seals happen to operate in one of the most competitive breeding systems that have ever been documented among mammals. And what I have been interested in over the course of my research career is how an animal like this little pup, gets to be this gigantic, successfully breeding male, and what it takes really to make it. And I will hopefully communicate to you that it is extraordinarily difficult to just survive, and then also to become a top contending breeding elephant seal. And so that's kind of what the story of my research has been about over this time, just kind of what is this trajectory of this little pup throughout his entire life. And so I want to start by saying, you know, basically less than 10% of males ever reach adulthood. And of that, less than 5% ever become breeding males. So as I will talk about, and as you probably know, elephant seals are extremely polygynous, meaning that one male monopolizes hundreds of females at a time. And so to become a breeding male is actually incredibly difficult. So very few actually gain reproductive access to females. And then most males die over the course of their lifetime, and there are varying reasons and explanations for that. But let's just say that the life of an elephant seal is very, very difficult. And I will try to kind of come back to that point often throughout this talk. So it all begins kind of as a pup. So life is very difficult for a pup, and mortality is highest during their first year, actually. So only about half of the weaned pups that you might see at a breeding colony actually return the following year. So mortality is very high. You can imagine if you're a elephant seal pup at Año Nuevo and you're swimming out to sea for the first time, you basically look like a little at-sea tater tot that is perfect for a great white shark to consume. Hence why you have such high numbers of great white sharks around Año Nuevo Island. And so it's very unlikely that you're even going to return the year after you're born. So mortality kind of, is highest within that first year. And Brian, how's my speed? Am I getting any comments about, am I going too fast or too slow? Am I good? I'll take that as a yes. So this is an old illustration of sort of just where elephant seals are going, once they do depart from the breeding beaches that we have become familiar with here in Monterey Bay. So these red lines and red tracks are males. So male elephant seals actually travel along the continental shelf, go out to the Aleutian Islands, whereas females kind of go out into the Pacific, kind of out towards Hawaii. So they kind of have this interesting sexual segregation in terms of foraging area. But this is a huge migration. I mean, very similar to the length of migrations of gray whales and other cetaceans that you all are very familiar with. They too are making these large migrations in search of food in sort of these reliably nutrient-rich areas. Of course, they're predated on, similar to other marine mammals, by great white sharks and killer whales. So that's likely what's contributing to their increased mortality in these areas. And so I just want to say, if you ever go to these breeding beaches and you happen to see a male northern elephant seal that is an adult, it's actually quite a feat to survive to reproductive maturity. And you kind of just have to tip your hat to that individual and say, good job, because it's very unlikely that they would have even made it to becoming an adult. Okay, so, I want to ask everybody, and I guess you can just say this in your head because it's difficult to communicate through Zoom, but, when you look at an elephant seal, what's the first thing that you notice about male northern elephant seals, right? I guess you can type it in the chat box and we can make it a little bit more interactive. So what are some noticeable characteristics among males? And maybe Brian or Tony could read them out loud to me.
They are huge. Simon says they are huge. Sausage people? Ted Cheeseman?
Sausage nose, maybe?
Proboscis. Kim says proboscis, chest, perfect. Shield, scars, breastplates, vocalizations. Perfect. Smaller than the southern species.
Yeah, those are all excellent observations. Exactly. It's that male northern elephant seals are sort of known for being one of the most sexually dimorphic species in the world. So they are extremely different from females. And so females, grow to be about 9 to 12 feet long and weigh between 900 and 1,800 pounds. And females can live a long time up until their early to mid 20s. Males grow 14 to 16 feet long, and the largest males can weigh 5,000 pounds, which I know to whale people is not that big, but when you see a giant elephant seal on the beach, that's 5,000 pounds. That's a big male. However, they only live to be about 14 years old. And so there are these extreme differences, like you all mentioned, the callus chest shield, the proboscis, the large size, that make them very different from their female counterparts. I just love to highlight their giant nose and their chest shield. So here's just a video of this nose in action. Those are females in the background, but they're very pronounced, and the size of the nose actually develops, over the course of a male's lifetime. So this is a young animal, about a 4-year-old individual, and you can see that the proboscis and the chest shield aren't quite present. And throughout developmental stages, 5-year-old, 6-year-old, 7-year-old, 8-year-old, and then another 8-year-old, and then 8+ basically as an adult, you see sort of how this nose develops. And so it's definitely a visual signal of sexual maturity among male elephant seals. However, interestingly, we still don't really know the role of the proboscis. We're trying to determine whether or not it's important in sound production, and also could it be a visual signal to other males to indicate its size, or a combination of both. But even though it's the most noticeable feature, we don't know exactly what it's used for in terms of communication. Okay, so clearly there's a huge difference between males and females, but why are elephant seals so sexually dimorphic? And I'm going to take a step back now and just talk generally about sexual dimorphism among mammals and what drives sexual dimorphism, because I think it's really interesting and is very pertinent to the story of elephant seals. So effectively, whenever you have male-male competition or high competition for access to females, you will often see the emergence of secondary sexual characteristics. And this can come in the form of weaponry, male weaponry, or also things that are likely to attract females. So beautiful feathers, on, say, a bird of paradise. Male elephant seals don't have secondary sexual characteristics that are used to attract females necessarily, as far as we know. Most of their secondary sexual characteristics are likely important in terms of male-male competition, because, as I mentioned, so few males ever gain access to females. So competition is extremely high. And among pinnipeds and all marine mammals, it's really the distribution of females in terms of their environment that drives the evolution of different mating systems and how competitive you really are within your breeding system. And this is true of cetaceans as well. So you don't see, necessarily a ton of sexual dimorphism among the cetaceans, because it's actually very difficult to monopolize multiple females in a three-dimensional environment like the ocean. But things are very different on land for some pinniped species. So for those pinniped species that breed on terrestrial haulouts, you see vast differences in terms of secondary sexual characteristics between males and females. So, if you have females that are easily aggregated, like in these little circles, so these are all females, then polygyny makes sense because you can easily monopolize multiple females at once. However, if females are difficult to corral either in space or in time, then monogamy makes more sense. So you can think of maybe, a ring seal out in its Arctic environment, and it's very unlikely actually that they're going to encounter multiple females at once. So if they find one female, they're going to be pretty excited and they're going to stick with that female for a set period of time before moving on. So it's really the environment that shapes the distribution of females, and then that drives the evolution of male behavior among basically any breeding system, whether it be terrestrial or aquatic. In terms of pinnipeds, there's lots of different breeding habitats that we see. We see fast ice, which is ice that holds fast to the continental shelf. There's pack ice, which is really unstable, where single animals haul out. So those are those ring seals, or in this case, a bearded seal. You have one female who's kind of out on his own. So a male is super excited if he finds her. And land and island habitats are where elephant seals breed, and also other otariids or sea lions or fur seals. And it's much easier for a number of reasons to monopolize females in this type of environment. It's much more predictable than, say, pack ice, which is relatively unstable and ephemeral. And so it is on these land and island habitats where you see the emergence of polygynous breeding systems, where you have one male monopolizing breeding opportunities among other males, and also the evolution of these secondary sexual characteristics. So, as I mentioned, and this is true for a lot of cetacean species as well, it's difficult for males to monopolize multiple females underwater. And in fact, in a lot of cases of most fosid seals, there's not a big advantage to being large. In fact, you might want to be maneuverable so you can find and copulate or mate with, females beneath the water's surface. However, if you are a seal, and out of all of the true seals, very few actually breed on land. So elephant seals are one of the few. Gray seals in certain environments certainly do, as do southern elephant seals, but in general, most phocids breed aquatically, and we don't know that much about their breeding behavior. However, if you're on land, everything changes. And here you can see why it's very easy to monopolize multiple females, because they're all aggregated together. Why do females aggregate together? Because it's safer. You know, if these animals have evolved in areas where there has been any type of predation, for example, or disturbance, it's much better to be, you know, 1 in 100, because your likelihood of being messed with by something is much fewer or much lower. So here, you know, this kind of looks just sort of like a weird aggregation of animals until you look closer, right? So you have females and their pups. The pups are the little black, you know, sort of meatball looking things associated with these brown females. You have one alpha male who's really responsible for the majority of mating with all of these females, and this is his harem, right? And then you have these other adults that we call beta males that are sort of, the alpha will tolerate within his harem and he'll kick out most of the time. But these betas are actually really important because they control the behavior of all of these super annoying peripheral males. So you have these individuals here, who are, you know, subadult to adult individuals who are constantly trying to gain reproductive access to these females, and these betas are very effective at sort of keeping them at bay. And a smart alpha will tolerate a few older individuals that they can kind of do crowd control on the harem. So that's kind of just a general makeup of what these breeding systems look like. And then this whole thing would constitute a harem. This is just a nice drone shot of Año Nuevo, the mainland colony that I'm sure many of you have visited before. And you can see that the harems are quite fluid, and you know, they're not delineated by territorial boundaries, as you see, say, in a California sea lion, where a male is like, this is my rock, don't step on my rock or I'm going to bite you. Males sort of will monopolize as many females as possible physically until it's too difficult. And then they sort of, the next male will sort of encroach and create his harem. And if the females move along the tide line because, say, it's hot or because the tide rises, males will move with the females. And so it's an interesting breeding system in that it's not static. It's kind of moving along the beach system throughout the course of the breeding season. Do we have any questions so far, or Brian, do you want me to save them until the end? What works best?
We're going to save them to the end.
Okay.
There's no questions so far.
Okay, perfect. So there are lots of different sites of elephant seal breeding colonies. And I just want to mention that some of them are very low density. And so, you know, you have one male here, this is in Mexico, and, you know, maybe 50 females that he's responsible for. He has a pretty sweet deal. He has like mountains on the backside, which protects the encroachment of other males. And he's got a water line that he can kind of patrol, but it's relatively easy to guard these females. And then some high density sites like San Miguel Island. San Miguel is the highest density area or highest number of elephant seals. I think there's about 30,000 elephant seals that breed there annually, compared to about 4,000 animals that breed at Año Nuevo, for comparison. So it's like New York City for pinnipeds. There's a lot of them there, and it's very dense. So I guess in summary for that section, the high competition between individuals leads to the emergence of these secondary sexual characteristics that aid in male-male competition. Bigger males theoretically are better fighters and might be more successful in breeding attempts with females. And for a male, the goal in life is to mate with as many females as possible. However, because so few males survive to adulthood, they're really only the top tier, the best males make it to the breeding pool within northern elephant seals. And so any adult that you see at a beach, again, is fairly high quality, big, and competitive. And I like to call them the Navy SEALs of elephant seals. These are like the males that you see at the beaches are really the best and have been able to survive, as you've learned, a ton of challenges throughout reproductive development. So I just, you know, are you in love with elephant seal yet? I think that most of you might be starting to tip in the direction of pinnipeds. I hope. But, you know, it's always good to check in and see if I'm being effective here. So in terms of just the natural history and a year in the life of these animals, it's pretty incredible what they do. This is a really fat individual. And they are arriving at the beaches right now or in December. They have just come from a long foraging migration, similar to other animals. They're capital breeders. So, you know, like Mistocete whales, there's a separation between breeding and foraging. And so they forage, like I mentioned, out in the Pacific Ocean or up in the Aleutian Islands, and then come back to the same breeding beaches every year. And so these guys have been feeding since August. So they're nice and big and fat. And they arrive in prime physical condition. However, they'll drop about 8 to 12 pounds a day throughout the breeding season. So by the end, they're like these like little hacky sacks. They're so like dilute. Sorry, I'm just grabbing my phone to make sure I stay on time. Okay. And as I mentioned, you know, males fight at the beginning of the breeding season to establish these dominance hierarchies. Now, everybody is, you know, thinks of elephant seal males as being, you know, having these big grotesque fights. And yes, they are known for doing that. However, as I hope to communicate throughout the duration of this talk, it's actually quite rare for them to get into these big bloody battles. So just keep that in mind. And once they establish these dominance hierarchies, they're pretty much maintained throughout the rest of the season. And it's interesting, males will fight prior to the arrival of any females on the beach. And then they'll figure out who's who, and then they will really use other methods of controlling one another that are not fighting for the rest of the breeding season. So they kind of have worked out who's in charge. This is a video that I took just a few days ago. These are two adult males. You'll see some markings on their dorsal sides, and this is made with black hair dye, as I'll discuss. And so we can keep track of them, and each male within our study site has a flipper tag, and we write the flipper tag number on their back so that we don't have to like peer at their flipper tag and be disturbing to them as they're resting. But these are two adult individuals that we've been tracking for 4 or 5 years respectively. Actually, this individual on the right we've tracked since birth, and he's 11 years old. And you can see there's no other females. These are all young males, and they are duking it out as to who is going to be the most dominant individual at this location. This is really energetically demanding and can be very costly. We have had individuals die over the course of the breeding season because of, you know, canine teeth through the skull. So they really only do this a couple of times during the breeding season, and most of the time they're trying not to fight. So females begin to arrive pregnant in mid-December, and they are ready to pop within 4 or 5 days. They gather together in these close groups called harems, and then they give birth to a single pup that they will nurse for about 27 or 28 days before departing back to sea. And then those pups stay on land for another couple months and learn how to be an elephant seal and learn how to swim. Meanwhile, males are spending most of their season running around, calling, chasing, and attempting to be as close as physically possible to the females. It's very dynamic. It's kind of like a game of chess out there in terms of continually trying to breed if you are an animal or a male. So here's just an example. This is an alpha guarding a harem of females. There's some other individuals who are trying to challenge him. He's calling. And then this guy now is getting out of there. There are these, you know, subadult males here that he's worried about. There's some researchers conducting resites on this colony in the background. And you can see, I mean, there's at least 12 males that are just waiting for the opportunity to infiltrate his harem. So it is a very busy time for these alpha males, and they expend a lot of energy. So males at the bottom of the pecking order gather together outside the breeding beaches in bachelor pods, but are always looking for opportunities to breed with females. So most of the males are not breeding males, but they're still there in the colony, which is interesting, likely learning, you know, social information in terms of how to best attain, you know, a high dominant status within the system. And it's really only during the last 2 to 3 days before females depart back to sea that she is ready and in estrus and ready for mating. And this is basically what every male has been waiting for. and interestingly, peak breeding occurs during the second week of February for Valentine's Day. So everybody always asks me, what's the best time to go and view elephant seals? And it's Valentine's Day, because that's when things are getting really exciting. And females have a really difficult task because they have been basically allocating all of their resources to their pups, and they need to go back out to sea. However, there are all of these males waiting at the tide line, just waiting for this opportunity, who would also like to mate with her. And we call this running the gauntlet. She has to go from the safety of the harem with the alpha out to the ocean. And this is where we've seen the highest risk for females as they have been trying to depart, because at this point, you know, an alpha will sometimes escort a female all the way out to the ocean. However, that leaves his harem quite vulnerable. So depending on how motivated the alpha is, he may or may not do that. So it's really interesting. Some males, their strategy is really to just wait at the tide line the entire season for females to depart, and hope to kind of get that one opportunity with them. And while most females leave by the end of February, males stay through the end of March. And so this means that they will go up to 3 months without access to food or water. They're fasting this entire time, which is really amazing. And they have, I mean, different talk about the physiology of elephant seals, but they are incredible at retaining water resources while they are fasting on land. Okay, so you're probably wondering, like, wait, who are you? What do you do again? And why are you talking so much about elephant seals? And what is your specialty exactly? So I'm going to spend the last part of this talk kind of telling you a little bit about the research program that I'm a part of at UC Santa Cruz and what we are doing in terms of evaluating the individual behavior of male elephant seals at Año Nuevo, at the Año Nuevo breeding colony. So what we're really interested in is getting to know individual animals and telling their stories. And the way that we've been able to monitor animals at the site really allows us to determine kind of who these animals are, what they sound like, who their social competitors are, and how their social behavior changes from year to year. And so this is a long-term research program. I've been working at the site since 2009. So the animals that we've been studying, we know really well, similar to a lot of the research that's taken place here in Monterey Bay or in Stellwagen Bank with humpback whales. These are individuals that we have, you know, for lack of a better word, have loved and have tracked for a long period. So I'm very proud of my involvement in this research. We primarily work during the breeding season, which is right now. And so this is from December until March. And these are just the different times that animals are hauled out at Año Nuevo, if you're curious or ever want to go and see elephant seals. But we primarily work during the winter. We have a fairly comprehensive approach in terms of how we get to know these individuals. So unlike humpback whales, for example, that are easy to distinguish between individuals based on their fluke patterns, elephant seals, I can't tell the difference between them physically. And so we have to insert these cattle tags into their rear flippers. A lot of them are tagged at birth, but we have actually been tagging animals when they're a little bit older while they're sleeping. And this allows us for in between year identification. Once we have spotted a male that's within our study, we apply black clariol hair dye to their fur so we can observe them from a distance, so we don't have to get so close in order to see their ID. This is what it looks like. I like the approach of sneaking up on them and not disturbing them too much. Usually I'll mark them when they're sleeping, and they're kind of like a VW bus. They have a bit of a blind spot. So if you kind of go up behind them at the perfect angle, they sometimes will not see you. And here's an old video of an example of that. Oops, there we go. So this male is just kind of resting, and the older individuals are much more tolerant of you just kind of hanging out around them, but he doesn't, as far as I know, he doesn't see me sort of marking him. So this is kind of a low impact way of being able to identify them within each season. Get very sneaky. And additionally, as I mentioned, we apply these cattle tags to their rear flippers. Unfortunately, because so many individuals die within the first year, we found that there weren't that many, when we first started this project, there weren't that many adult males who had tags. And so we started applying tags to our study animals so that we could track them between years. And to be honest, we weren't sure we could do this successfully on non-sedated animals, but we've sort of found this approach where animals have to be very, very tired. And that's sort of like receiving a quick ear piercing. So they don't love it. However, they usually will return back to their behavior shortly after being tagged. And it's great. And then we can identify them throughout the duration of their lives. And this is just sometimes we have to get very close to the animals in order to read their tags because unfortunately they fade over successive years. Okay, so every day that we go out into the field, we note the distribution of the animals that we study and we recite them. And this just means that we take GPS locations of each individual animal over the course of their time that they're hauled out for the breeding season. And usually we try to be minimally disruptive and approach them when they're sleeping. And this allows us to do some really interesting work evaluating kind of the fine scale movement patterns of males at this breeding location. So what you're looking at here in purple is the distribution or the available habitat at the Año Nuevo site, so where animals could haul out. And here is a kernel density estimate, or basically a home range area of one individual adult. And so all the green dots are his recite identifiers for the entire season. And then you can see that this is his general home range and then a more conservative estimate within here. And so long story short, this animal is very loyal to this particular breeding area. And in comparison, younger individuals don't have that same site fidelity within the breeding colony. They tend to roam around quite a bit and try their luck at lots of different harems. So this is recite information again for some younger individuals that are about 5 years old. And they just kind of cruise around until they become adults. And then they actually have much greater site fidelity to a particular breeding area as adult animals. The other thing that we do, which is really interesting, is we score competitive interactions between competing males within the breeding colony. So each individual animal that we've identified, we then just do behavioral observations of. And this usually just requires us to sit up on a dune and just watch animals, which is maybe one of my favorite things. And if we could do this for cetaceans, in the same manner, I think it would yield some incredible results, because the things that you see in the dynamics between individuals, and then the way that you can then conduct experiments that test specific hypotheses based on what you're seeing is such a rarity among marine mammals, and why I think elephant seals are such an amazing model for studies of behavior. And so here's an example of one of our field technicians doing those observations. And what we note down for every interaction is the apparent winner and apparent loser. So this is really anytime we see two individuals interacting with one another, we jot that down, right? And so in this instance, we noted that the animal in purple is the winner and the animal in green is the loser. We also note, whether or not they vocalized during this interaction, how far they moved, and the total distance between these individuals during the interaction, which allows us to answer some pretty interesting questions. For example, what proportion of interactions contain the use of vocalizations? And what we found is that 76% of them actually do, and that fighting is actually quite rare. Most animals don't fight, but are able to resolve conflict through the exchange of sort of these calling or visual displays, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a bit. The outcome of these interactions are fed into what's called an ELO dominance rating system. So effectively, every pairwise interaction is used to calculate an overall quantitative dominance rank for each individual within our study. So every year, everybody starts at the same level of 1,000, which is just an arbitrary score. And then their scores are adjusted based on the outcome of these competitive interactions with one another. So you can see in this example that GL was the most dominant animal within the site at this particular year. And 11R was kind of a wimp. And so this is great because it gives us a way to quantify dominance rather than it being so descriptive, you know, alpha, beta, peripheral. It's just a nice way to kind of verify the observations that we're making in the field. And what we've learned from watching these animals over the course of the past several years is that, you know, only 6% of fights actually lead to any contact. So when animals are interacting with one another or have some type of conflict, it's very rare for them to fight. And less than 2% ever end in like a sustained fight, so like a big battle. And as I mentioned, 73%. In 73% of all interactions, the winner will vocalize. And so the question is, well, why don't they fight more? You know, why is it that they are mostly calling and not fighting? And it's because it's really energetically demanding. You know, these animals are fasting during this entire time. It's very costly, and they're trying to retain resources so that they can breed with females. Sorry, that was for emphasis. And this is just an example of a male that we found who had been in a sustained fight. And you can see here that he took a canine tooth through the front of his skull. And so it doesn't make sense for males to continuously fight because the risk of death is high. And also, you know, the energy stores that they so sorely need in order to reproduce are being depleted unnecessarily. I'm going to skip this video. And so instead, males don't fight that much, but instead move one another with their vocalizations, which is something that I have become really interested in over the course of my career. So I'm going to play you an example video. And just, I want you to note the distance between these individuals and how this male is able to move this other individual acoustically. Much nicer than fighting. You know, this guy doesn't even have to do anything. And this guy gets the message, right?
6TH, moving.
Very effective means of kind of controlling the behavior of other individuals, right? Oops. And fighting usually only occurs between two equally matched individuals after repeated vocal exchanges. And so what this video demonstrates, I'll just kind of fast forward, is a male threatening another individual who's all the way over here. And they really try not to fight. You know, they basically exchange calls back and forth multiple times. They're the same size, and likely they haven't fought previously, and so they're trying to duke it out. But look how many times they're calling at one another, hoping that the other individual will back down. And so this is a typical interaction, and usually, you know, it's resolved through one of these vocalizations. And in this case, it didn't work, and so they get really close. Will vocalize right in one another's face, and then they'll engage in combat. So you might ask yourself, or I ask myself, you know, what type of information are they exchanging exactly? You know, what are they trying to communicate within the exchange of these vocalizations in this video that we just saw? You know, is it individual size, dominant status, or is there some other type of information that's encoded within these very special signals? And so I and our research team became very interested in terms of what information is actually encoded within the vocal displays of male elephant seals. So we set out to determine whether or not there were differences in the calls between males. Do all males sound similar, or were they different? And if so, are the differences meaningful to rivals? Can other individuals actually evaluate and extract meaningful information from those individuals and then make decisions about their behavior based on the content of those calls? And I'll just say again and reiterate, these types of experiments are very difficult to do in marine mammals. They've been nearly impossible in nearly all marine mammal species, with the exception of, say, like the Sarasota bottlenose dolphins, where they've done some really incredible work on similar questions. But in general, you know, because animals aren't easy to observe and track, and do experiments with, this type of kind of fine scale evaluation of functionality of acoustic displays is quite rare. So for this, you know, in addition to all of the different methodologies that I talked about before, we started recording and analyzing the calls of individual males for this experiment. We took two types of recordings. You know, one is with a directional microphone here at some distance from the animal. And then this is what it looks like. You know, the displays of males are fairly fixed. And so if you're experienced, you can kind of effectively move in, record an individual, and then move out without putting yourself at too much risk. And the idea is to remain below the threshold of females around here. So here's a male calling. I'm recording him. He's not worried about me. There's a male behind me who he's trying to displace. And then I can move away safely. It took me a very long time to learn kind of how to navigate their behavior and not put myself in risky situations. And then also we conducted some really interesting work on evaluating the amplitude of individual male calls. And so this is a sound level meter. And so if we are 1 meter distance away, we can actually evaluate how loud these animals are. And we published a paper last year showing that elephant seals produce one of the loudest sounds in air of any terrestrial mammal. They're louder than howler monkeys, lions, and yeah, they're incredibly loud and impulsive signals, which is pretty cool. Okay, so what did we find? You know, what do males sound like? So these are calls from 3 adult males that we tracked over the course of a single breeding season. And first, what we're looking at, for those of you who don't do acoustic analysis, this is a spectrogram, right? So you have time here on the x-axis, frequency on the y-axis, and these colors indicate kind of the intensity or the pitch at different frequencies. So where it's brighter, that's where the pitch of the signal is more intense. And you can just see structurally, these calls are very different from one another. And I'll also mention that these 3 males had some of the highest ELO scores at the colony. So this is a call from one animal that we called 3C. It's really nice, very staccato. Now, you know, compare that to an animal like this, 10A. Different, also beautiful. And then finally, this is one of my favorite calls from an individual named X579. Okay, so, you know, you have probably listened to this once, and I'm sure that you can tell the differences structurally between these individuals. And if you do a more in-depth analysis of adult males, what I'm looking at here, or what we're looking at here, is that there are a couple of call characteristics that really separate the calls of adult male seals in acoustic space. And it's a spectral feature, so a pitch-related feature, and a temporal feature, which is the tempo of the call, is enough to be able to reliably differentiate between individual males. So each dot is a male here. And so you can see in acoustic space, they're all quite different from one another. And then the circles around these dots represent the standard deviation in the call parameters that we measured. And what that means is that males are incredibly reliable in terms of the signals that they produce. And so within an individual, there's very low variability, but between individuals, there's high variability. And that's a really important part of this story. So takeaway message, you know, are there reliable differences in the acoustic displays of male northern elephant seals? Yeah, they possess very different characteristic calls for each individual male. And these calls, we did an analysis between seasons, they're very stable once males reach adulthood. So for example, X579, that last spectrogram that I played you, we heard him at the end of one season, and the next season he hauled out and called. And before I had a chance to check his tag, I was like, oh, there's X579. He's so, you know, stable between years. And importantly, calls don't seem to indicate motivational state or willingness to fight. So they don't change across contexts. It's not like the more angry a male is, the louder he is, or the faster he calls, or the lower he calls. It's extremely fixed. So, you know, to address our second question, you know, is this information actually useful to listeners? We had to adopt some experimental methods that had previously been used in studies of birds. And these are playback experiments. in which effectively you want to test what the signal actually means to individual animals in the field. So in order to do this, we recorded the calls of known males, right? And we composed these playback tracks comprised of 3 individual calls. And then we connected it to a speaker, placed that speaker some distance away from a target animal, and then measured the behavioral response of the target individual to a specific call, right? So that's the general design. And what we wanted to know whether or not an individual male could actually tell the difference between the calls of his most familiar dominant and subordinate rivals, right? So are they able to discriminate and detect differences between individuals? So for example, in this study, we selected kind of these beta males that had known alpha and subordinate and dominant rivals that we had seen interacting with over the course of a single breeding season. And we thought, okay, if we expose an animal like 16R, who's this mid-ranking beta male, to his most dominant familiar rival, to the calls of his most dominant familiar rival, we would expect him to retreat from the speaker. And conversely, if we exposed him to his most familiar subordinate rival, 11R, who he had heard multiple times and he always won in the outcome of those vocal exchanges, we would expect him to approach the speaker. So we selected 10 of these mid-ranking beta males and exposed them to 2 different playback treatments based on observations that we had made in the field in real time. This is kind of what that looks like, you know, so we try to be out of view as much as possible. So this is a target male that we're testing. Here is a wireless speaker that's approximately 7 meters away or so from the focal animal. The criteria to conduct these experiments is excruciating. The animal has to be awake. He can't be rolled on his side or asleep. You know, there can be no other animals within the general vicinity that are closer to him than the playback speaker. He has to be not moving or interacting with anybody for a set period of time before the experiment begins. So these experiments take a long time to set up, and there's a lot of shuffling, and the tide comes in and takes your speaker away, and it's very long. However, and there's us. So this is a very old video of an example playback. So this is actually that same animal 16R who was receiving his familiar dominant rival. Here's the playback speaker. It's in a milk crate in this experiment. A handle dropped down denoting the beginning of the experiment. Again, this is his dominant rival that he's listening to. He's assessing. And he's moving away. You'll notice there's no other males within the vicinity, so it's likely that he's not responding to the call or the visual, representation of another individual within the area. This is that same individual now, and we are playing him now the call of his most familiar subordinate rival. The speaker is here. There's some other individuals within the frame. Takes them a while to assess this particular call. And he actually approaches and attacks the speaker, and we nearly lose this particular speaker. So, our prediction was that if a male heard the call of his most familiar dominant rival, then he would retreat in phonotaxis. He would move away from the speaker, and conversely, if he heard the call of his most subordinate rival, he would attack it, right? This was our prediction. And these were our results. So there were significant movement patterns in the predicted directions in response to their familiar rivals. So you might ask, okay, great. So maybe they can tell the difference between individual males. Males have these unique acoustic signatures, but how do you know, Carolyn, that the calls don't contain some type of information about size or dominant status or something genetically related that they are assessing that doesn't really require familiarity, but they can just extract naturally from the call. You know, you hear the sound of like a low bark and you're probably more afraid than, you know, a high-pitched squeak from a dog because there's some type of size information encoded in those signals. So we wanted to test that. You know, are males actually learning the calls of other individuals and learning how to respond to them, or are they extracting information that's encoded in those calls? And it doesn't necessarily require experience with that individual in order to know how to respond to him. So in order to evaluate that, we went to a colony at Piedras Blancas down in San Simeon, and we conducted very similar types of experiments that we did at the Año Nuevo site. So we selected some mid-ranking males after scoring interactions here, and we played them back the exact same playback treatments that the males at Año Nuevo had received. The only difference is that they had never had direct experience with those individuals. And so if there was something naturally encoded in those calls, then they should respond similarly to the calls, similarly to the way that the males did at Año Nuevo, right? Because there's something that's indicating size in those calls. Conversely, if it requires experience, then they shouldn't show sort of this kind of predictable differentiation between dominant and subordinate playback treatments. And so these were our results from the playbacks from Piedras Blancas. And so they didn't respond at all, interestingly, to the calls of unfamiliar males, which really indicates to our team, in addition to some other analyses that I don't have time to get into, that the calls of male elephant seals, similar to you know, the signature whistles of bottlenose dolphins, serve as individual labels for each male seal. And they each produce calls that are meant to communicate who that animal is. And if that individual has encountered another animal before and they have fought, then that other animal can recall that previous experience and say, you know, I know that guy, that's Tim. I lost to him last time. I don't really want to mess with him again. And so I'm going to avoid this costly interaction. So kind of in summary, you know, males produce individually distinct vocal signatures during the breeding season. And these signals function to control the movements of familiar rivals with minimal cost of conflict, right? So they don't need to fight that much because they can just exchange these names and say, hey, I'm Bob, get out of here. We fought before, don't mess with me. They don't appear to convey, you know, how big an animal is or how dominant he is or how motivated he is to fight. And what I think is really incredible is that individual males are remembering the identity of their, you know, social interactants within a breeding colony based on these call characteristics. And they can distinguish between different animals based on these signature calls, which I think is incredible. It indicates a lot about their memory. And then I'll just end by saying that right now we are tracking the development of young males through reproductive maturity. We're curious about what you know, younger individuals are doing on the colony and how they acquire these really specialized calls. So we've been tagging, you know, very young individuals and trying to track them throughout reproductive development. Just as a teaser, you know, you saw the amazing fights of these older males, and this is, you know, meanwhile, what younger individuals are doing. So it's sort of like just amateur hour at this location. I love them, you know, a lot of really interesting social interactions here. And if you're interested in learning about these young guys, we just published a paper in Animal Behavior last year, looking at the behavioral ontogeny of male elephant seals at Año Nuevo. So you can learn all about it in this paper. And that's it. I just want to emphasize the importance of these long-term studies. They're very difficult, as a lot of you probably know, to acquire support for, because they require just a long-term investment in individual animals. However, I believe, and I hope I've been able to communicate the value of this type of work in terms of solving these really big picture ethological questions that are difficult to resolve when you're just taking a minor glimpse at an animal or a population. You know, sometimes the best work comes from tracking and getting to know individuals as representatives of their population. So I'm very grateful to be able to work at this site, and I'm happy if I have time to take any questions from you all. But thank you for your attention and for being a part of this evening. I really appreciate it.
Awesome. Thank you, Carolyn. That was amazing. I've learned so much. So right now we'll be taking questions. We already have a good amount of questions in the chat, so I'm going to go through people's questions. If some of the questions that we're going through during her talk, some of them were answered. So if it wasn't completely what you're looking for, or you want more information about it, feel free to put it in at the end, or type it in now, and then we'll talk more about it, because a lot of the questions were answered later in the talk. But the first question that I got from Carol was, do beta males mate with females in the harem as well?
Yeah, you know, there have been some studies in the 70s that looked at like copulatory success of alpha versus betas, and alphas account for about 80% of all copulations. But that does leave a good 20% to these other guys. So yeah, they have different strategies, and that's one of the things that I'm evaluating right now. I just put a proposal in to look at like, what are the different strategies that males exhibit. And I mean, you have these sneaker males that like tuck their noses in and like sneak into the harem pretending to be females. I'm not joking. And like fly under the radar. You have some males that sleep in the dunes for like half the breeding season and then have like all this fat on their body still, and then roll down and like try to you know, overtake the alphas. So it's really interesting, but betas do attain some copulations, but the majority of them are dominated by alphas.
Wow, I did not know it. Wow, that I'm trying to think more about that right now. Okay, next question is from Terry. It says, do you tag and monitor the females too, or just the males?
Yeah, so Dan Costa, who I'm sure many of you know, has a long-term research program at UC Santa Cruz, and his group has been really focused on monitoring the behavior and both at sea and on land of females. So we've kind of partitioned the sexes. I do male work, and he is really focused, and his graduate students are really focused on females. I do know we've studied acoustic behavior of females and their pups. We just finished a 2-year project evaluating recognition between females and their pups. So I certainly have an interest in them, but I don't track them in the same way that I do with the males, but Dan does.
And then the next question is from Diane. It says, what is the mortality of pups on the beach being crushed by adults?
Yeah, it is. Well, so it's hard. I'm trying to recall, you know, there was that study that said that half the pups die within the first year. And I think that they divided out what the cause of mortality likely was. And I want to say it's less than 5% are crushed by males. A lot of them, it's like disease, you know, separation from mom, predation. But it's a very small amount, but it's very tragic when it happens. So I would guess less than 5% are actually killed by males, although it does happen. They're actually really resilient. I've seen males cruise over pups with their whole 5,000-pound body weight over them, and they sort of just like a tumbleweed roll around and then emerge on the other side still alive. And I'm very grateful.
Zarmeen asked, why are their necks red? I think he was talking about one of the pictures. It didn't look necessarily like blood, but it was kind of more something else. Is it just blood? I think that's what his question is asking.
I'm assuming you're referring to the males that have blood on them, and it's like super, super, super red. And that's because elephant seals have a lot. I mean, like most marine mammals, if you were to make an incision in most marine mammals, it would be like red, like this plant. It's like amazing. And it's because they have a lot of hemoglobin for oxygen binding during diving. And that creates a red pigmentation that makes it very bright. So their blood is just redder than ours. I hope that answered the question.
I think so. Oscar is asking, are they likely related? And I think this was around with the males fighting each other.
Yeah, so I mean, on the topic of relatedness, these animals, as I mentioned, are incredibly inbred. And so up until recently, most evaluations genetically had found that that they basically are more or less like all cousins, and it's very difficult to distinguish genetically between individuals and determine like relatedness, for example, among individuals. Now, with the evolution of more fine scale genetic analysis, we're actually beginning to be able to do like pedigrees of elephant seals. And so we have yet to apply that to male siring, but it is likely that they're all sort of related, with some individuals being more closely related than others. But I don't know the degree of that. And I don't think that we'll know that maybe for the next couple of years. But yeah, they're very inbred. And their mating system makes them even more inbred. So they went through this genetic bottleneck in the 1800s. And then it's like on top of that, only like 5% of the males actually contribute to the genetic pool. So it's just a mess genetically. But miraculously, they don't show a lot of issues genetically. They have some, you know, degenerative eye issues that they think are contributed to you know, sort of a low genetic pool. But other than that, they're pretty resilient. They're kind of like seagulls. They're like everywhere and they're doing fine. You know, I don't want to like hate on seagulls, but like they have no issues.
Jai, sorry if I butchered your name. I'm sorry. Jai asks, do you treat their injuries?
So we do not. And actually and for those of you that might volunteer at the Marine Mammal Center, feel free to jump in. But the Marine Mammal Center actually does not come to Año Nuevo State Park. They, you know, have determined that whatever happens within the state park is part of the natural process of elephant seal mortality. And so if it's not human induced, they won't come and like rescue a pup, for example. However, if an animal is entangled, I see a question here about entanglement, then we will relieve them of that. And to answer that question really quickly, we don't see as high a rate of entanglements among elephant seals as we do, you know, for example, in right whales or humpback whales here in the Bay, because elephant seals are primarily spending most of their time out in the middle of nowhere where there's not a lot of crab pots or other fishing line. And so where they're primarily foraging is not overlapping in the same way as like other cetaceans do in terms of their interaction with humans. So they're a little bit better off.
Carol then asks, do they ever charge you?
I mean, you saw a few videos where I was pretty close for recordings, but in general, I like to stay below the threshold of inducing a behavioral response because I'm interested in what their natural behavior is like. With that being said, I have been charged it's usually a younger animal who they're pumped full of testosterone during the breeding season. They have some of the highest testosterone levels of any animal. And so occasionally I will be just in the wrong place at the wrong time, and in which case they'll charge me. But I try to avoid being in that position because I really want to know just what they're doing with each other, and I try not to put myself in between them and what they're doing.
WG is asking, do the members of the female harems change from year to year, or do they stay together? Thank you.
Really good question. I don't think that it's been published, but my understanding is that once a female has reproduced successfully within a given harem, then she'll return to that same location. So it's sort of like, okay, I gave birth to a pup this time last year, and he survived or she survived. I'm going to come back the following year. And the majority of the animals come back to their natal breeding colonies. And so most of the elephant seals that we have within our study that are tagged were born at that location. And that's true of both females and males. Of course, you have some dispersal. That's how new colonies get started. But I would say 70 to 80% of the animals stay at Año Nuevo.
Jamie Flynn is saying, I am studying natural resource education. How do you get involved with studying seals? And do you have any advice for someone who is entering the conservation field or conversation field? I'm pretty sure they meant conservation.
Yeah, it's a really good question. You know, I got involved in the field by volunteering and interning, and there are lots of great internships that are paid here in Monterey Bay that you can be a part of. Monterey Bay happens to be maybe one of the best locations in terms of getting involved in marine mammal research. And so between Moss Landing Marine Labs, UC Santa Cruz, Hopkins Marine Station, and all those opportunities at Monterey Bay Aquarium, the Marine Mammal Center, it's like really about getting your feet wet and just kind of getting to know what the different entities are that are conducting research in this area. And then you can email me afterwards. We have a nonprofit that helps to try to connect individuals with different research opportunities here. And we offer lots of classes during the summer, which is really a mentoring opportunity for anybody who's interested in this field to get to know different researchers and, become more familiar with what they're doing.
Ted Cheeseman is saying, sweet results. Does recognition of individual persist between seasons, or is that even relevant if individuals are totally different between years?
Ted, that's like what I'm doing right now at this moment. We are so animals are stable between years. Once an animal reaches adulthood, they are very loyal to a particular breeding site. And so year after year, you have the same males aggregating at like this we're talking maybe a half a mile, area for one harem where males are kind of aggregating around. And there's maybe 15 harems at Año Nuevo. So males are kind of centralizing into one location, really getting to know who those animals are within a season, which we've tested. I've been attempting to do between season recognition experiments to see whether there's kind of a long-term effect of these dominance hierarchies, or alternatively, if they're reset at the beginning of each breeding season. The problem that I've had is that my sample size has been very small because they die. So I'll test them at the end of 1 year, and then I'm hoping to reacquire them the following year and retest them again to see whether or not there's carryover. But so far I have had 6. And I'm trying to add 10 this year in hopes of getting a larger sample size. But it would be really interesting either way, right? Like if they do recognize, or those dominance hierarchies carry over between seasons, that's cool. If not, that suggests that perhaps it's reset based on what the animals did at sea at the beginning, prior to each breeding season. So I think the results are interesting in either way.
Connie is asking, how do females breed the first time since they are not coming to the beach to give birth?
I'm not sure I understand the question. I mean, the females, they first breed at about 4, 5, 6 years old. And it's interesting, they have embryonic diapause, meaning that they get fertilized. I'll just talk about the reproduction of females. They get fertilized on the beach. Say it's like their first reproductive year, they go into estrus, and then they are fertilized by a male, and then they go out to sea, and they have a 9 to 10 month gestation, but they want to synchronize their birthing at the exact same time every year. And so the fetus will develop for a little bit and then pause. And then it won't develop until a little bit later, so that they can give birth in about January at the same time every year, which is really interesting. And then every year thereafter, they reproduce. Females, almost all females will reproduce 1 pup every year. So I hope that answered the question. The reason that they want to synchronize it to the same time every year is because, as we all know, in Monterey Bay in April is the best time to wean your pup, because then there's all this upwelling happening and there's lots of nutrients. And so they want to make sure that their pups are nutritionally independent at the same time every year. And so it's this really incredible thing that they do, where like the embryo develops and then pauses and then continues to develop so that it's synchronized.
Carrie's asking, do the subadults fast and stay on the beach throughout each breeding season?
So weird, right? Like, why are those little guys there? What are they doing? They're not breeding. What they do is they arrive in November and they fight with one another, not with older males. Older males aren't even back yet. The older males get there in December. So these young teenage, I call them like the JV varsity team, arrives in November. And yeah, they're just kind of messing around. And I think there's a lot of really important social exchanges taking place during that time. They're sort of doing a lot of mock fighting, a lot of mock calling. And then they tend to leave prior to the arrival of the big males that come in December. And so that paper that I mentioned that we just published looked at the duration of time ashore across different age classes. And the young males don't spend that much time there, but they do come back. And it's like, why don't you just hang out and forage that whole time? That would be a better idea in some regards. So clearly there's some social elements that are really important in terms of wanting or needing to come back to interact with one another.
Alana is saying thank you, and she's also from the UK, so she's saying it's definitely worth getting the early start. And then, do you see any aggression from the males towards the pups? Example, to induce early estrus in the females, or are they tolerant to pups that aren't their own?
It's fun, you know, males really only have eyes for females and destroying other males. Those are like their top two things. If a pup is in their way, they will, you know, roll over it. I've never seen a male aggress towards a pup or initiate any type of like paternal care. So it's difficult to assess whether or not, it seems to me that they don't really have a huge investment either way in a female. And I don't know that killing, I'd be interested to know whether killing the pup would induce a female into early estrus. It's a really good question. Females will kill or attack pups that do not belong to them. So I've seen far more aggressive interactions between females and pups that are non-related, because a lot of pups get separated from their moms and will try to nurse from moms that don't, you know, belong to them, and those females will often bite and thrash and throw pups that are non-related. And then the last point is that some subadults, similar to sea otters, because they have a lot of testosterone, will occasionally try to mate with pups, because I think they're just displacing a lot of the sexual aggression onto pups, unfortunately. So we had one male last year who unfortunately was running around mating with and killing pups, and the public was very upset, and we couldn't really do anything about it. So yeah, it does happen.
Diana is asking, can you briefly discuss any trends in site fidelity?
Yeah. So in terms of, you know, big picture, as I mentioned, both females and males will come back to the breeding colony that they were born with, the majority of them. We do have animals from other sites present at Año Nuevo, some from Piedras Blancas, the Channel Islands, you know, Point Reyes, but they're very few. Most of them were born at Año Nuevo. And like the females will stay within a particular breeding site if they've successfully raised their pups there previously. The males will come back year after year. I mean, the majority of the males that we tag not only come back to the same colony, but come back to like within 5 meters of the place that if they were successful last season where they were previously successful. They're very, very loyal to particular areas of the breeding colony. And this is really conducive to, you know, individual learning and recognition, which, as I hopefully showed, was really important to male behavior. So they really are. I'm now trying to determine whether young males are sort of like, do these males know each other over the course of their entire lives and are like fighting each other in like the last years of their life, but growing up together at the colony. So I'm trying to get at, you know, what the stability of these social relationships over multiple years, but that's a difficult question to approach. So yeah, I would say that they're really loyal to their breeding locations. And it's pretty incredible. I mean, they're foraging just like, you know, all these other marine mammals, they're foraging over these vast distances. It's like, how do they arrive at like literally the same GPS location every single year? And we don't know how elephant seals navigate, similar to other marine mammals and cetaceans. Like how are they getting back to these locations and finding their way home? I don't know.
Okay. And there is a handful of questions at the end. I'm gonna let you pick what you want to talk about, just because there's a handful of them, and they're kind of all over the place, from global warming, if there's any effects on that, or kind of their feeding behaviors. So is there any last kind of remarks that you want to talk about? Because everyone's also saying
Yeah. I would say that in comparison, I mean, obviously they are, like all animals, vulnerable to global warming, but unlike some pinnipeds that have very centralized feeding locations that are susceptible to, small, slight variations in terms of oceanic features like temperature or prey distribution. Elephant seals are foraging over a very long period of time and acquiring resources not instantaneously, but over several months. And so they seem to be a little bit more resilient to environmental change. And if I was going to call out, potential winners and losers of global warming, I think that they're more likely to be behaviorally adaptive, given the fact that they are not trying, like a California sea lion is nursing their pup and then alternating going out and foraging at sea. So they can only spend 4 days out foraging before they have to come back. So they're really tied to a central location, and whatever's available to them within a specific vicinity is what their pups get fed, and so that's bad if, like, 1 year the fish are no longer there. But for elephant seals, because there's this separation between feeding and breeding, they can acquire resources over a longer period of time, and so are less sensitive to small disturbances in kind of these regional areas. And so elephant seals happen to be very resilient, I think. Yeah. And maybe the male show vocal learning. Elena, or Lana, however you pronounce it, that is my number one question. Vocal learning means that you have to learn the sounds that you acquire through social interaction. So we're vocal learners, right? If you raise a human, God forbid, in social isolation, they won't sound like a normal human with speech development. Whereas if you raise a dog in social isolation, they will still sound like a dog. And so humans are a rare animal that demonstrate vocal learning, along with parrots and cetaceans and elephants and maybe seals. We're still trying to evaluate that. I think, long story short, I don't know. I am very interested in this topic, and my guess is probably, but you can read the 2020 paper for more information on that, because I spent a lot of time discussing that point because I think it's really interesting.
Awesome. So I would like to say thank you so much for joining us. Is there any way that you could probably put your email or any way to contact you into the chat so that people can somehow, get more information if they want to? Awesome.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah, please email me with any questions that you have. Sorry, I didn't get to all of them, but it was a lot of fun talking with all of you.
Yeah. Thank you so much for joining us. Just a couple last remarks. I'm so sorry. I totally forgot to tell everyone about ACS International Conference. It's Saturday, January 30th from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. Lots of different speakers throughout the whole day. So feel free to sign up. The link is on at acsonline.org. And then just to remind everyone about future meetings, most likely are going to be pushed to 7 o'clock, as well as our newsletter is going to be put online. You will get the February one, and it's just budget, COVID, so we're just trying to think of better ways to budget ourselves. So yeah, and thank you so much. And I have to ask my last question. I just, any tips for anyone who's new? Like, I know that we have lots of younger individuals who are interested or are undergraduates in the chat right now. Any tips or anything that you want them to know?
Oh my gosh. Yeah, first of all, you can email if you're looking for resources of how to get involved with this type of research or marine mammal research in general. I have a big document that I've created for some of our students, and so feel free to email me if that's something that you're interested in. I would say, for me, I never went to school because I wanted to become, in the higher echelons of academia. I always just really loved the system that I was working on. So I would say find something that you're just like crazy passionate, will stay up in the middle of the night thinking about and love doing. And that'll take you to I never thought I would get my master's. I never thought I would get my PhD. I never thought I would be a marine mammal researcher, and because I became so invested in this system, all of these things started happening, and it's been such a gift for me. So I would say find what you're passionate about, independent of what your ultimate career goals are, and then invest fully in that question or that species or that system. And I think that a lot of opportunities will become that. And also use the resources that you have here, and use me. Yeah, email me and I can connect you with a lot of different great volunteer and internship opportunities that are here available locally.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And thank you everyone for joining us. And I hope everyone has a great night. So thank you.
Yeah, bye.